Hi everybody, this is the first lecture. This is on the science of psychology. Before I go too far into the lecture, just to remind you to do Lab 1. Lab 1 is the first thing to do for this class. I would do that first before watching this lecture. It's due Thursday this week, and so it's very important to do because that's also used to take attendance. If you do not complete it by that date, the assumption will be that you're not attending class and you might be dropped from the class. So again, we're going to be doing the science of psychology in this lecture. And I'll just sort of say that sometimes students tell me that they prefer shorter lectures. What I'll say is for this online format, you are in total control of the lecture time. So depending on my recording conditions, sometimes I'll record things in parts, there'll be shorter things. Other times there might be longer lectures. You don't need to watch the lecture as a whole if you don't want to. So if you like to have a break, take a break, go away and come back and watch the rest of it. So how you watch the lecture, how much at a time, is really up to you. So with that in mind, remember that you control when you can watch things and how long you watch for. And what I'll also say is that for this class, it tends to be a lot more, I don't know if piecemeal is the right word, but the lectures will tend to be like little pieces of information you need to know. There doesn't necessarily will be like big themes for the whole lecture. There'll be pieces of information. And so keeping that in mind, it might be a lot easier for you to watch the lecture in parts if you prefer that. Give me a second, things are stuck here. Okay, so also, if you have not watched the video that overviews the course, the welcome video that goes over the syllabus, please watch that video also before you start this lecture. So make sure that you watch the welcome video, look over the syllabus, complete Lab 1 before you do this lecture. So psychology is a science. So let's think about what is a science. So how would you describe a science? So write down your ideas. Also, you might want to write down your ideas about what's the scientific method. So pause the video, write down your ideas, and start the video again when you've written these down. So probably part of what you wrote down or what you thought about what a science is what we call empirical. What does empirical mean? It means that we're using our five senses to observe and measure things. So a big part of science is observing and measuring things. The things we're observing and measuring are variables. So if you watch the video for the first lab, I already talked about variables. And the thing though is it's not just this. So it's not just looking at something and measuring something. So it has to be systematic and structured. It's not just informal. Informal observations is not science, even though it is empirical. It's not science until the observation and the measures you're doing are systematic and they're structured. And in terms of science, in terms of this empirical aspect of science, we often talk about the ROT aspects of it. So ROT is repeatable, objective, testable. So what does repeatable mean? It means that if I do a study, when I write it up, I specify how I do everything in my study, how I observe things, how I measure things, how I collect my data. I give enough detail that you could read my study and you could repeat it. So in science, we want enough detail, enough systematic and structured observations and measures that somebody could repeat that study. What I'll say is that in psychology, this is a little bit different than perhaps in other sciences. So in the so-called hard sciences, they might do a lot of replications because it's really easy. Even it's expensive, but it could be easy to run the particle accelerator. If you're a particle physicist, you could repeat that. You could do it one day, you can do it the next day. So you can repeat it. In psychology, it's harder to do that. It's harder for us to quickly repeat studies. So in psychology, we don't necessarily repeat the same study, but people will use the same measures that you use, the same methodologies, but they might do it in a slightly different way. In psychology, we have this thing called a replication crisis, which means that we aren't doing these replications, but I don't see it as a crisis because in psychology, because of the nature of what we're studying, people, and it's hard to study people, it takes a lot of time to get data. We often want to do this thing called the nomothetic network, which is if I'm curious about a research question, so let's say I have a research question about narcissism being related to aggression. To me, in psychology, it would be kind of stupid to do the same study over and over again. So let's say I do a study, let's say I give people a questionnaire on narcissism, I measure narcissism with that self-report, and then I set up a situation where they can act aggressively towards somebody. I think it would be kind of stupid in psychology to repeat that same study over and over again. Who cares? It's actually a problem to do it over and over again because there's things we call method variance. So we actually want different people using different methodologies, examining the same research question to see if they find the same things. So some people might use a self-report to measure narcissism. Some people might use observer reports of narcissism. So you have somebody bring the person to the lab, you set up a situation, you observe whether they're narcissistic or not. The expert would give a rating to the person. We could have informants. So we could ask family and friends. We wouldn't say narcissism, but we'd have a list of questions that are related to narcissism and ask people about those questions about the person. And in aggression, the same thing for that variable. We can measure it in different ways. We can ask the person how aggressive are they, a self-report. We could set up a lab situation where we maybe frustrate the person and see if they act aggressively towards that frustration. We could also have informant reports. We could have informant reports, again, family and friends. In general, in everyday life, how aggressive is this person? So all of these different types of methodologies are addressing the same question. Does narcissism relate to aggression? And the thing is, if people using different methodologies come up with basically the same answer to that question, then we have built up a nomothetic network of research findings that will support that assertion that narcissism is related to aggression. So I do want to sort of talk about this, that the repeatability in psychology is not doing the same study over and over again. So we're not really concerned about replication of the same study over and over again, kind of a waste of time in my view. But do different people using different methodologies say the same thing about that question? So in psychology, the nomothetic network is actually more important than replicating the same thing over and over again. So that's what we mean by repeatability in psychology. How about the Owen rot? So the Owen rot is objective. Objective just basically means people can agree on it. So if something's empirical, you should be able to agree on it. So, for example, if I have an observer measure of narcissism, and I have two separate people watching the same person, doing the same things, they should roughly have the same ratings of narcissism. It probably won't be exactly the same, but roughly the same. There should be a good agreement if my measure works well. So objective is that people can agree on what you see, what you're measuring. If I see aggression, you should see aggression also. And then the T in ROT is testable. So testable is we can collect data, we can run statistics using our P is less than 0.05 rule from your stats class. We can set up rules about whether we reject the null hypothesis. We can make inferences from our inferential statistics and make some sort of conclusions, so it's testable. It's testable because we have measures, they're empirical measures. We can run statistics. We have rules for what we say is supporting our alternative hypothesis or not. So we have these strict rules for testing our research question, our hypotheses. So empirical has all of these components, and we're really concerned about that ROT. ROT is a really important thing to remember. And I also asked you about the scientific method. So probably when you were thinking about scientific method, you were probably thinking about somebody in a lab coat, right? Somebody who's very systematic and careful. So scientific method is what we call systematic empiricism. So I just talked about in the previous slide that empirical doesn't mean just kind of informally watching and looking at something. We do that in everyday life. But science is more systematic. So we very carefully do our empirical methods to get our measures, to get our observations, to get our data. If you're doing experiments, you're doing controlled conditions. So when you're thinking about scientific method, maybe you're thinking about a lab with a lot of control and what's going on in the lab. You can also do naturalistic observations in a scientific method, but when you do naturalistic observations, you make rules. So if I'm going to observe something in everyday life, I make a rule about how I sample that behavior, who I look at, what qualifies as this thing, that thing. So it's very systematic. So the control is not necessarily there in terms of controlling the environment, but you set up rules to be systematic in your observations and measures. Also, the scientific method theory is really important. It's called rationalism. So use of theory, because we use a theory to generate our research questions, to generate our hypotheses that we're going to test. And as you'll see as we go through the class here is that pretty much the start of all research is theory. So in this class, for example, for your research project, once you sort of identify some general research questions, a big thing you're going to be doing in the first step is to be doing a lit review. You're going to be reading previous research, previous articles about that topic. And a big thing you'll be getting out of that reading of the lit review is theory. A theory that explains why your two variables are connected, for example. So in your research question, you're talking about the relationship between two variables usually. So the theory should explain how and why they're connected. So if I think narcissism is related to aggression, why do I think that? What does the theory say about narcissism, narcissists being aggressive? Why are they more aggressive? So it's those explanations that are really important in science. And one of the reasons why we start out with theory and with these ideas early in research is that you can do research on anything. You can collect a bunch of data, you can collect really good data, be very objective, reliable data, you can do all the stats you want, but in the end, once you have your statistics, if all you say is, oh yeah, they're correlated, and that's all you can say, it's who cares? The research is useless. All of those scientific methods, data, findings in your statistics, they only matter if you have a way to explain them, to give them meaning. So theory is a way to give meaning to the data. So that's why theory is really important, because if you don't have that solid theory to start with, you're going to collect a bunch of data, but you can't make any sense of it in the end. It won't say anything. And in the scientific method, we know that we want to specify our ideas a little bit more, so we want to have hypotheses. So we're starting off with research questions, for example, for our research projects. And then you're going to be reading some lit review. And in the lit review, you're going to read about theory that connects and explains why those variables are related to each other. And once you have those ideas, you can generate very specific hypotheses. So the hypotheses are more specific statements about what you're going to test. So the research questions tend to be a little bit more general. Hypotheses are very specific. And you can think about your statistics class. So in your stats class, you were taught to generate null hypotheses, alternative hypotheses, and to test the null hypotheses with your inferential statistics. So if you remember those hypotheses, they were very specific. So hypotheses are more specific statements that reflect the research question. And again, hypotheses should have that rot aspects that we talked about. They should be repeatable. So if I test a hypothesis, you should be able to test that same hypothesis also. They should be observable and objective. I'm sorry, I wanted to double check the objective. So they should be objective. So a big part of objectivity in hypotheses is that we set rules. So when we test a null hypothesis, we have very specific rules. So the rules that we often use in psychology are p is less than 0.05. So that's our rule about whether we're going to reject the HO or not. And we set these rules ahead of time. So part of the objectivity of this rot is that we set the rules beforehand. We don't want to collect the data, analyze the data, and then set the rules afterwards, because oftentimes we'll change the rules, right? Like, oh, look at this. We got a 0.08. That's our rule. So 0.08, reject the HO, where we found something. You don't do that. You set the rules ahead of time because we want that objective set of standards that we need to follow. And then it has to be testable. So it has to be testable. So testable, we're just talking about that with statistics. We test our hypotheses with our statistics, our inferential statistics. We test it that way. Our statistics tells us things such as, do we reject the HO? Is there some support for the HA? And it also tells us things like effect size. So even if it's significant, is it something that's big in terms of its effect size, or is it small? So all these things are testable. And so, as I just mentioned in this last point here, is we have rules about the evidence and our standards. So things like p-values and how we test our ideas with our statistics. So part of the scientific method is these rules and standards. And again, we set these things beforehand. It's called a priori. So a priori, so prior. So beforehand. Before we collect our data, we set our rules. And when you're thinking about the scientific method, you were probably thinking about the process of research. I'm not going to go into this in super detail, but you probably know this already. So we talked about the importance of theory at the start of research. This is how we generate our research question. We do a lit review. We specify our hypotheses. When we're specifying our hypotheses, we're oftentimes defining our variables. So how am I going to measure narcissism? How am I going to measure aggression? We want to then design our study. So am I going to do an observational study in the real world? Or am I going to do an experiment in the lab? So that's about study design. And we'll talk about more about these things, obviously, as we go through the course. This is the course, this whole slide, essentially. Then we collect our data. So we design our study, then we collect our data. Once we have our data, we analyze our data, so you should know that stuff from your stats class. We interpret our data, and then the interpretation of the data feeds back into theory. So I often think about this like an hourglass. So it's general at the start. So we start with the general thing about theory, general research questions. We get more specific with hypotheses. Then we get really specific in terms of how we measure our variables, what our study's design is, what our data is. That's really, really specific. And then we go out more broad from there. So once we have our data, we have to analyze it. So we go out a little bit more broadly. We're making some inferences from the data, from the sample to the population. We're interpreting the data. We're making meaning of the data. So we're getting more broad. And then at the broadest step on the bottom is, well, we did our study. What does our study mean for the general theory, the general question we started with? So it's like an hourglass. And this is what we're going to be going through in the class. So lab number 1 is about generating your research questions. Later on, we're going to specify your hypotheses. Later on, we'll think about how we're actually going to measure your variables. We won't design a study, but you'll design sample studies that you won't actually do as part of your lab experiments. So as part of your lab exercises, you'll be designing studies that we won't conduct, but you'll design some. We have the data that's collected, so we're going to be analyzing your data. I think that's around week 5 or 6. We're going to interpret your data, and then when you write your paper, the end part of your paper will be thinking about how your study relates to the broader questions, the broader theory that you used. This is also the shape of your paper that you're going to write. We'll talk more about this later, but a research paper starts off with the research question. It examines the theory through previous research, the lit review. The lit review looks into the hows and whys, so why are these two variables related to each other? How does narcissism affect aggression? That leads to this hypotheses. So in your research paper, at the end of your introduction, you're going to specify your hypotheses. Then there's a section called methods. The methods will be about how the study was conducted. Then there's going to be a section called results. Results is actually going to be your statistics. And then the final part of the narrative of your paper is called discussion. Discussion is interpreting your data. So remember what I said earlier is that you could have some really nice observations, nice measures, really nice statistics, but it could mean nothing if you don't have a theory to interpret the data. So the discussion, you are interpreting the data using the theory you talked about in your introduction. And also talks about, at the end of your discussion, about, okay, well, I did this specific study. How does it address that bigger issue that I started with way at the beginning? So not only is this the process of research, but also this is going to be the format of your research paper. And again, we'll talk a lot about that as we go through class. And the nice thing about research is it creates public knowledge. What does that mean? It means that we just don't do things in our lab and keep it to ourselves. Science is meant to improve people's lives, help us understand things better. So in academia, when we do science, oftentimes that presentation of public knowledge is through conference presentations and publishing. So you go to conferences, you present your research, people talk about your research, they might criticize it, you think about it a little bit more. And also, hopefully, people go to publish things in research journals. And the big part of this is that science is meant to be open to criticism. And so if you're doing science, you should be willing to be open to what you did, what you found, what you think it means, and be able to stand up to scrutiny of other people. So criticisms of other people, questions from other people. Scientists should not be defensive. They should be willing to talk about these ideas. So part of the public knowledge aspect of science is to be open about your data and about your findings and what they mean, and to be willing to debate those in a rational, intellectual way, which seems very, as I'm saying this seems very much different from what's happening in our society right now. But I hope that we can reach that sort of point where we can talk about ideas and be more rational about things. But science always should be that way. As I'm saying this too, is that scientists are not perfect too. So there are scientists who are defensive, who are kind of set in their ideas. That's just human nature. But how do I want to say it? The activity of science should be open for debate. And what I'll say is, just from my own personal experience, is that when you go into scientific endeavors, you have to have a thick skin. So you need to be able to stand up there, and people will say that you're wrong, that you're full of crap. But you need to be able to fight back, if you will. You need to be able to say, here's the evidence for this. And then the nice thing also about presenting and publishing things is that you want to make connections. So in scientific endeavors, we never think that we have the final answers. We know that science is always a progression. This is why you should never use the word prove. Science never proves anything. So we never know anything for certain. So we understand things better. But we also know that things will be understood differently in the future. So when you're thinking about making your research public, it's really useful to connect with past researchers. So what does the past science say about this issue? And then here's how I'm advancing, saying something new about this question. But I also need to say, well, what should we do in the future? I know that my study is not the end point. Where should we go from here? So this acknowledgement of sort of the process of science in a large aspect, that we're going to look at things throughout time. Just checking time as I said that. And so when we publish things in journals and we present things at conferences, we know that science is a social endeavor. So it's a social thing. So that presentation being published is a social event. Also, in general, every researcher who does a study needs to recognize that their study is situated in the work of other people. In many ways, that you could be a collaborator with people in the past. They could even be dead now, but you're doing some sort of research that's advancing the topic that somebody wrote about 50 years ago. And you also know there's a sense that if you're lucky, somebody, when you're dead, 50, 100 years from now, 200 years, we'll just be really generous there, that somebody's going to be writing about your ideas. Also, science is what we call self-correcting. So I mentioned earlier that we never think that we have the final say on something that's a scientific question. We know, for example, methodologies improve over time, and methods change our understandings of things. We also know that there's going to be advance in the understanding of what's going on as more people do this question in terms of their studies. And so we say it's self-correcting in the sense that we know that in science, we're going to have more and more of the picture there, but the picture is never 100% perfect and finished. So we understand people better over time, but we never have the final answer. So we should never be 100% sold about our ideas or about our study, because we know that it needs to be tweaked in the future as people find more information. And in terms of psychology as a science, and I'd say that psychology, to me, why psychology is so interesting is it has that mixture. So in science, our understanding of people is driven by the scientific method. So in psychology, our understanding of people is driven by the scientific method. This is true even for applied psychologists. So I had somebody in a stats class once who was frustrated a little bit with the stats and said, why am I doing this? I'm never going to use this. I'm going to be a therapist. And I told this person, I said, you're going to be a horrible therapist then. If all you know about therapy is what you know from your classes, you don't read journals about how to treat people with different problems, you're going to be, to me, an unethical therapist. Why? Because you're going to be doing things that are 20 years old, 30 years old. You're not going to be doing the state of art. You're not going to be helping your clients out as much as you can because you're stuck 20 years, 30 years behind. A therapist should be reading journals, reading research about new techniques, new therapies, and looking at the empirical evidence about how effective those things are. So in my mind, even if you're in, I shouldn't say my mind, but from psychology's viewpoint, even if you are not doing scientific research, you should be using scientific research in your applied setting that you're working. So we have the scientific method, and that's how we understand people. That's how we understand things such as what therapeutic techniques work best with certain people, with certain problems. But we also have the beauty of psychology being that we can understand human beings, our humanness, our wholeness. So in my mind, our scientific research is done to understand what makes us human, what makes us a whole person, different systems working together, our cognitive systems, our emotional systems, our cultural systems, our attachment systems are from our early childhood. So developmental things that happen during our childhood and adolescence that affect us. So how do all these things connect and integrate and makes us into the person that we are? So to me, psychology has that beauty. It has that beauty of being scientific, rigorous, empirical, while at the same time understanding people in terms of who they are as a whole. And to me, psychology is fairly unique in this. So obviously humanities delve into what we are as human beings, but they don't get into the scientific method. They just sort of speculate about things. And then there's other sciences that look at the world of physics and chemistry and cultures and social context. But to understand individual human beings, psychology is kind of unique in the sense of blending science with the individual human being. So this is what makes me excited about psychology is it has this mixture. So let's think a little bit about the scientific method a bit. So I want you to think about, are the following questions empirical? Or statements. So I love you so much. Is this an empirical statement? This is a little bit tricky You might say, oh yes, you can ask somebody how much do you love your partner, and you can put a 1 through 5, 5 being really high and 1 being low. Yeah, maybe. But for me, this is not an empirical question. And I'm not saying that love doesn't exist. I believe in love, and I've made major decisions in my life, probably the most major decisions in my life based on love. But it is not a scientific concept. I study romantic relationships. I can't tell you how you can measure empirically the quantity of love. People really don't differ in the quantity of love. They vary in the quality of love. If you've listened to the lab exercise 1 video and heard me talk about preoccupied, secure, and dismissing, those are qualities of love. They're not quantity. Is this an empirical statement or question? You are so jealous. This, I would argue, is empirical. Jealousy to me, as a more or less, would be pretty easy to measure. How would I measure it? I would think, well, what are some markers or behaviors that would show that somebody's jealous? So things like, how much do you text your partner each day? Asking them where they are. Are you concerned about your partner's love for you? Are you concerned that your partner really loves you? Do you worry and are you anxious about where your partner is at night if you're not with them? So there's probably different things that I can think of that I can measure it. I could probably measure it, especially if I could get your telephone records, right? Your cell phone records. If I could look at your text messages, I could probably get a good index of how jealous you are through the text messages. So this is something I could probably measure empirically. This is probably an empirical question. Okay, now I want you to go ahead and watch this video. If you look at the PowerPoint, I post the PowerPoint for all the lectures on Canvas. You can go to this slide number 18. You can cut and paste the URL there. Watch that TED Talk. It's about 16 minutes, so watch the TED Talk, and I'm going to have you write down what you think about the ideas that he presents and what aspects about the talk made you feel this way. So again, what do you think about the ideas presented, and what aspects about the talk made you feel this way? So now pause this video and watch that video. And once you're done watching that video and writing down your reactions to the video, start this video again. Okay, now that you've watched that video and you've written down your ideas about that video, I want you to watch this TED Talk also. It's a little bit shorter, it's about 11 minutes. So this is slide number 19, I believe. Yep. And so you can cut and paste this URL and watch this video. And the question that I want you to answer after you watch this video is, has this talk made you think It's weird. How has this talk made you think differently? Sorry about that. About your answers about the first video. But regarding, so don't say about twice. So sorry about that, not regrading, but regarding. So watch this video and then see how it may or may not have made you think differently about that first video. So go ahead and watch that talk and pause this video and restart it when you're done with that TED Talk. Okay, so you watched the second video. I'm guessing that you probably think a little bit differently about the first video. And what I'll say is that the second video is sort of bringing out an argument that maybe that first video was a bit of pseudoscience. So in psychology and other sciences, we're often really concerned with what's called pseudoscience. What does pseudoscience mean? Well, let's just look at the word. So pseudo means resembles. So resembles science. So in psychology, one of the things that drives a lot of us crazy is that if you go to the bookstore and you go to the section that's called psychology, quote unquote, 80%, 90% of those books there are pseudoscience books. They sound good. They sound rational. They look like they're experts. But in reality, it's just a bunch of bunk. So I'll talk a little bit more about pseudoscience in a second, but let's think about the first video. And we'll think about that in relationship to the second video. So I'd say that there's some aspects of pseudoscience in the first video. One aspect of pseudoscience in the first video is that it was vague and exaggerated in terms of its claims. Oxytocin makes you feel happy and good and makes you moral. That sounds a little exaggerated in my book, right? And it's also a little bit vague. What do you mean? What do you mean by moral? You know, what is that? I don't really understand exactly what you're meaning. So it's vague and exaggerated. And then also when you're thinking about that, well, you have this you hug somebody, you get oxytocin, and it's supposed to make you do moral things. Well, how does that work? So the actual explanations about what connects A to B, oftentimes there's not a lot of explanation there in pseudoscience. Oftentimes also in pseudoscience, we have people that reduce everything to one variable. So the author of the first presentation reduces it to hugging, reduces it to oxytocin. And actually, he has even sold businesses on this, that they'll make their businesses more effective, basically with this premise that just need to raise the oxytocin of your employees. Well, that's very reductionistic. You should be very careful about people who make claims about broad aspects of behavior being due to one small little thing. Anecdotal evidence, so personal experience. So oftentimes pseudoscience gives anecdotes. So in science, we don't really care about anecdotes that much. In fact, they're kind of the bane to our existence. So in science, we look for patterns, and those patterns are general. And so in psychology, we would never say that everybody acts the same. So I can tell you that your attachment in childhood is related to your attachment in adulthood. And that's a pretty strong correlation, but it's not going to be the same for everybody. So when we talk about science and psychology and somebody in class says, oh, that's all wrong because my cousin did this and he's totally different. Yeah, duh. There's no claim in science and psychology that everybody is the same. So we resist anecdotal evidence. We want to look for larger patterns among larger groups of people. In this first talk, an aspect of pseudoscience was not presenting a full picture. So if you remember the second talk, she says, yes, oxytocin is related to some of the things he said, but oxytocin is also related to things like in-group, out-group thinking, which is related to prejudice. So all of a sudden, this oxytocin that he claims is moral, a moral molecule, is leading to some pretty bad things of discrimination and prejudice. And so he presented just one side of it, just the positive side, if you will, of oxytocin. He totally ignored the other stuff. So in pseudoscience, people are oftentimes just presenting the snippet of stuff that promotes their point of view. Another sort of aspect is that Dr. Love, that really kind of irritates me. It might sound kind of cute, but for one, if there's some stranger walking around calling himself Dr. Love that they want to hug you, you probably shouldn't. You should probably run. It's probably somebody you should be aware of. I'm not accusing him of anything, but it's a weird thing to call yourself. Obviously, it's part of sort of a publicity thing. Is to sort of you can sell books better if people think you're Dr. Love. And also another aspect of pseudoscience that might not be so obvious in listening to the talk, but just sort of if you go onto his webpage, when there's money to be made, I would be very cautious about pseudoscience. There's a lot of money you can make in pseudoscience. Just go look at all those books in the bookstore in the psychology section that are million sellers. They're largely pseudoscience. And so for this person, he has a book that he sells. He charges, not for TED Talk probably, but for other places. Like if he speaks at different places, he will charge for that. And he charges for consulting for businesses. So unless this webpage has changed, I haven't been on it for a couple of years, I guess. So maybe some of this has changed, but he used to charge businesses. Basically, he would say, I'm consulting for your business. I'll make your business better, because we know that happy employees are more productive. And so I'll come in and I'll induce oxytocin into all of your employees, and your workplace will be much more productive because of that. There's a lot of money to be made for that if you can sell that to people. So I would always be cautious when there's money at stake. And more broadly, so I just wanted you to get sort of a taste of pseudoscience experientially, just sort of watching and experiencing it yourself. Here's some contrasts. So science versus pseudoscience. So science, we're about evidence. Pseudoscience, they have a conclusion they want to push, and they work backwards and try to find things that confirm it. So in science, we actually seek disconfirming evidence. In pseudoscience, they're seeking confirming evidence. I have an idea. I'm going to look for the things that support my idea only, and I'm going to only talk about those. Hostile to criticism, I would be aware that they're probably pseudoscience rather than scientific. Science is precise and clear in its definitions and terminology. Pseudoscience throws around vague jargon. It's hard to pin them down. So they like to be very flexible. So if you say that oxytocin is a moral molecule, what do you mean by moral? What does that mean? In science, we are pretty conservative and we're very tentative. We know that we understand parts of things but don't understand everything. Usually in pseudoscience, it's like, I understand everything. This one little variable explains everything. No, it doesn't. Nothing works that way. So in science, we consider all evidence. So like in the example we just saw, so oxytocin might be related to bonding, for example, with babies and mothers and fathers. Although oxytocin is related to breastfeeding and things like that, especially. Yes, that might be true, but we also know oxytocin leads to things like prejudice and discrimination. So if you're going to say it bonds, you better talk about how it also pushes people apart. In science, we're very rigorous. and specific. In science, we engage with larger peers and community, oftentimes with people who disagree with us. But we welcome that because we want to have our ideas to be rigorous. And they're only rigorous if we can answer criticisms. In pseudoscience, they want just only you if you believe the same things. If you don't believe the same things, then there's something wrong with you. We talked about the rest of this here. You can look through the rest of the list. I don't want to go through everything. Here's another list. So in science, we're often open to new evidence, new ideas. In pseudoscience, they're resistant to new ideas. And in science, we're often concerned about over-exaggeration of things. And in pseudoscience, that's what they do. They over-exaggerate things. Again, you can look through this list. I don't want to repeat things from the other list, too. And as we're thinking about this, your book refers to some great myths. And you can actually look that up. I think it's a website. So if we look at pseudoscience versus science, pseudoscience is things like most people use only 10% of their brains. That's dumb. You're not just using 10% of your brain. For one, we can't really measure brain capacity. I'm not sure how you would measure that. I mean, I guess we could all agree that there's potentiality in your brain as it's growing to make a lot of neural connections. You know, millions and millions of neural connections, but to say that you only use 10% of your brain is really stupid. Some people are left brain, some people are right brain. That's really dumb. Your brain, parts of your brain are not separated. There is some lateralization. The left brain does do some things, and the right brain does do some things, but that's not in isolation. So there's no such thing as left brain and right brain, but that thing has been sold a lot in pseudoscience. You can buy books, and there's workshops that people pay hundreds of dollars to go to workshops to be more creative and be more left brain or whatever it is. Beware of crap like that. That's not really true. Adolescence is a time of psychological turmoil. No, it's not. You look at the evidence, it's not. This is actually a very cultural belief. If you go to Asia, for example, not many Asian cultures believe this. Memory is like a video recorder and accurate. No, it's not. You probably have taken general psych already, obviously, so you probably saw a lot of evidence there about how memory is flawed. Low self-esteem is a major cause of psychological problems. Not really. Probably the stuff that causes low self-esteem is the root of problems, but self-esteem itself is not really the problem. Self-esteem is probably a symptom of something else that you experience that has caused various psychological problems, and self-esteem is just one of those things. But if you believe in pseudoscience, there was a lot of stuff that came out in terms of how to raise the self-esteem of your kids. Well, that's not really the thing you should do. You should give kids a pretty realistic, positive outlook about themselves, but you don't give them a false sense of self-esteem. Thing that drives me crazy about babies self-soothing. There's a big self-soothing movement in America, which is horrible. It's very unscientific. It's based on I guess a behavioral idea that you're reinforcing the baby's crying if you pick it up. Nonsense. If you look at the science, babies that are picked up earlier in life when they're crying cry less when they're older. Babies who are picked up when they're crying become more independent as children. So if you actually look at the scientific evidence, it's counter. But you should kind of also, in some ways, trust your gut. Regardless of where you think it's from, whether you think it's from evolution or from deity, it doesn't really matter to me. We have systems in us that guide our behavior. And one of those systems is that when you hear a baby crying, how does it make you feel? It makes you feel uncomfortable, right? There's a reason for that. Pick the baby up. You have a system in you that says, attend to that baby. Address why it's crying, whether it's hungry or whether it's scared. It's a baby. The baby doesn't have the neurological development to self-soothe. Babies will stop crying because they learn that nobody responds to them. Is that a good thing to happen? No, it's not. So there's all these myths that are out there. There's all this pseudoscience, and if you know psychology, it can drive you crazy because oftentimes the pseudoscience is opposite of what you should do. I'm just going to check our time here. And the thing about the science and pseudoscience is that in science we want to be skeptical, but what skeptical means is that we're not cynical and distrustful. It means that we want to understand evidence. We want to have rationality. Also with science is that we should have a tolerance for uncertainty. So when we do science, we know that we understand a little bit of our question, but we don't understand all of it. And that's important because pseudoscience oftentimes wants to explain everything. They somehow feel like if you can't explain everything, you're wrong. Well, no, that's not how it works in the world. So in science, we have this tolerance for uncertainty. And for this class, when you're writing your research project paper and you're doing your discussion, oftentimes what students do is they'll oftentimes say things like, oh, this is just a small little study. It's not really worth anything. So I didn't find anything, so who cares, you know? It's like, you don't want to be like that. You don't want to just sort of dwell on the shortcomings. Oh, I didn't do this right. I didn't do that right. You don't do that. When you do science, you say, okay, what did I learn? You want to acknowledge the shortcomings, but you don't dismiss the findings because of those shortcomings. And another thing that we should sort of cover in this first lecture is thinking about the goals of science. So when we do scientific studies, well, what are the goals? So we already talked about that the role of theory is really important in science. So theory is really central to science and scientific studies. But the goals of science are to describe, to predict, and to explain. So to describe is we want to specify what's going on. So we already talked about that. For example, in your hypotheses, you want to be very specific in what you're predicting. When we think about how we measure something, we want to be very specific in how we measure something. Because at the end, we want to be very descriptive of what we're seeing in our study. We also want to predict. And so part of that prediction is our inferential statistics. So in inferential statistics, we're taking our samples data and we're making inferences about the population. So from my study, I should be able to predict in general how people act. And effect sizes. So the effect size will say how much that behavior will be linked to that variable. And we want to also to explain. So remember the importance of theory and the importance of theory explaining the hows and whys for the two variables. So why are two variables related? How is narcissism related to aggression? So the explanation is getting to the underlying, what we would call mechanisms and processes. So with a narcissist, we can say that narcissists have a very vulnerable sense of themselves. They actually feel very insecure, but they do not want to admit that, and they don't want to show that to other people. So they walk around beating their chest and saying, I'm perfect. I'm a perfect genius. They walk around, strutting around, and all they do is they always want to prove how smart they are. They're never wrong. Well, guess what? If somebody questions what they think, a narcissist is going to be very angry, very aggressive towards that person. How dare you say I'm wrong? How dare you say I lost? I did not lose. It was fixed. So, the theory of narcissism explains the link between narcissism and aggression through this idea that there's this vulnerable sense of self. And to maintain that defensive sense of that you're great, anybody that chips away at that or questions that, you're going to be very aggressive towards them. Sometimes in textbooks, in the past, I think that's kind of disappeared, is they used to say the goals of psychology was describe, predict, and control behavior. I think that control of behavior has dropped out, I hope. The reason why in some older textbooks you'll see control behavior is because of behaviorists. So if you remember behaviorists like Skinner and Watson, they thought that if you could understand the mechanisms of reinforcement and punishment, and you could control that, you can control people's behavior. So if you ever see a textbook that is sort of in that behaviorist fashion, sometimes it'll talk about control, but obviously that should not be a goal of psychology. Sometimes there's a distinction between basic and applied research. Basic research is basically understanding something more. So it can be for knowledge's sake, and it can be very detailed, very accurate, very meticulous. Sometimes the basic research is not directly linked to a practical problem. So they're just curious that these things are related. There's no practical problem there. And in applied research is that's primarily addressing a practical problem. So I talked about therapy earlier. So applied research could be, does this therapeutic technique work well with the symptoms of PTSD? So post-traumatic stress disorder. So that would be a very practical problem, a very applied research. The thing is, in reality, the distinction between these two are fuzzy. So some of the most basic research that's ever been conducted had great applications in real life. And some of the most applied research has to be dealing with the basic questions of basic research. So you need to have detailed, accurate understandings. You need to have strong theory, strong data to actually have effective statements about how to address this practical problem. So you will sometimes see this distinction between basic and applied research, but in reality, the distinction between the two is not really that clear. I think in your textbook, it talks about experimental psychologists. It's just saying research psychologist. And in psychology, people tend to specialize. So you have people who do research on development on social situations, on how people think, cognitive psychology, neuroscience. There's all of these types of research. And an experimental psychologist will typically work in a college or university. So they're also doing teaching. So think a little bit about careers in terms of research. Even people who do a lot of research are also doing things like teaching students. There are some exceptions, of course. There are some peer research institutions. But if you're talking about colleges and universities, most of the experimental psychologists also teach. Then we have clinical psychologists. So they can be considered practicing psychologists. A lot of those people will have PhDs, which are research degrees. There is a PsyD, A PsyD is more of a practice degree with less emphasis on research. If you are interested in clinical psychology, I would advise more towards the PhD because it gives you more flexibility. Because you never know. You might think that you want to be a therapist, and then 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, you might not want to do it much anymore, but you might be stuck in doing that. And so the PhD gives you a little bit more flexibility if you want to go that route. Of course, you can do masters. There are people with masters that can also become therapists, depending on the state laws for the state that they're in. But when you're a clinical psychologist and you get a PhD, they use this thing called scientist practitioner model. So as I mentioned earlier, is that even if you're a therapist, your techniques, your approach to your client should be informed by research. If it's not, you're just doing things that you learned in the textbook 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That's very unethical. So for clinical psychologists, they often talk about empirically supported treatment models, which means that the therapy that you're doing, the techniques that you're doing in your therapy are based on research that demonstrates that those techniques are effective for people who are presenting those types of problems. And this is, a relatively long first lecture, but, lots of things to sort of situate ourselves for the course. So when we're thinking about this, I know that most of you have taken this course just because you have to. Very few people take this course because they want to. But I hope that you'll find that this course is useful. At the very least, I hope that you leave this course less likely to fall prey to pseudoscience. So hopefully you won't believe nonsense that's out there that's actually harmful advice. Harmful for you, great for them because they can make a lot of money selling books and workshops. Also when you transfer, so when you go to your transfer school, you'll have the skills, the knowledge that you need to take upper division classes. And for some of you, I would highly recommend trying to be a research assistant at your transfer school. So even if you're not interested in research, being a research assistant gives you some experience in that. I recently taught a course in careers in psychology, and I had a lot of guest speakers, and all of the guest speakers, and these are different guest speakers with different backgrounds, all of the guest speakers said to the students was, when you're a student, get a lot of different experiences. Because while you're a student, you can have lots of different experiences. There's lots of things that you can do. And they're very low cost in the sense that you can do it for a semester or for a year and you can get out of it. It's not like a job. A job's different. That's high cost. If you think you want to do something, you get into that job, you train for that job, you've only done stuff related to that job, you get into the job and you hate it. What are you going to do now? That's a high cost thing. So as a student, try out different things. And I would say that one of the different things that you want to try out is research, even if you don't think that you'll like it. For one, it will tell you whether you like it or not, and also that research experience will be very helpful. So if you want to get a master's in counseling psychology or clinical psychology or something like that, having that research experience will give you a leg up in getting admitted to master's programs. Also, what's really nice is if you're a research assistant at your transfer school, it gives you a connection right away in that school. So usually what I tell people is the semester before you transfer, look at the psychology department, look at the research that's being done in the psychology department, identify one or two people that are doing research, professors that are doing research that you're interested in, and email them and ask them if they are interested taking on undergraduate research assistants. If you do something like that, the second you step into your new school, your transfer school, you know somebody in the department. Also, when you're doing research, other professors see you there and they say, oh, you're here. they get to know you better. So you actually get more out of your undergraduate experience if you are doing, for example, research experience. Also, that professor that you're doing research experience with often becomes a mentor. They can advise you about your career. They can advise you about grad schools. They might have connections in, I was going to say the real world. That sounds kind of weird, but connections outside of the university. So if you want to do some sort of work or internship, they might know somebody who is looking for somebody doing that type of work. So a research assistant experience is more than just research. It's about other things. So I kind of recommend getting that experience. And just sort of let you know, when I was in school, undergraduate, I still remember this. I was talking to my advisor, who was a clinical psychologist, and I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. I was like, oh, I'm going to do therapy. That's all I want to do. And he said, well, you should really get involved in some research in the department. And I don't know if I said anything to him, but in my mind it went, why would I do that? And so I just did practical things. I worked in a high school. Basically the program was for kids that are sort of at-risk kids. And then I worked as a volunteer in a forensic mental hospital, psychiatric facility, essentially for people who had committed crimes but weren't in prison because of a psychiatric diagnosis. So I did all these types of things and did no research. I'll tell you that I was probably 2 years behind when I graduated. Even though I got pretty much straight A's and I had these practical experiences, when I tried to go to grad school and I tried to think about other things I wanted to do in my career, I was probably 2 years behind because of that. So I'm sort of also telling you from my own experience. And also in terms of employability, so I hope that you had a good stats course, because if you can do quantitative analyses and you have that in your pocket, that makes you much more employable. Even if it's not a research job or a stats job, but just having that ability in your pocket gives you a leg up against other people. Because people are often afraid of numbers and math. And if you can do those things, it gives you an advantage. So it really helps you be more employable. And if you can do those things, you can oftentimes make a lot more money. And also just in terms of doing research. So part of what we're doing in this class is we're going to be looking at how do you construct questionnaires. So you're being a psychology major, even if, let's say, you go to the business world, if you know how to analyze numbers, that's going to make you more employable. Also, if you have a psych major, your boss might come to you and say, hey, I would like to do a survey of our customers. Can you do it? So having the ability to write a good questionnaire that measures something that's meaningful to make sense of the responses, these sort of types of research method things can really help you out in terms of employability and making more money in the real world. So I hope that you get these things out of the class, and I think that's it. So that's it for the first lecture, and I'll talk to you in the second lecture.